Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
And we are looking at Face to Face.
Har du ett bra sömnmedel?
Ja, för alltid vill du ha ett.
Vet du vad jag skulle vilja helst ha valt? Jo, att du gav mig det där sömnmedlet. Gärna en dubbeldos. Så kanske jag sover dubbelt så bra.
Och sen?
Sen skulle jag vilja sova här hos dig. I din säng. Utan att vi älskar. Men du skulle hålla mig i handen. Om det blev nödvändigt. Skulle kunna tänka dig det.
Om du tar rejält med sömnmedel bör du inte dricka. Här är alltså Valium på 0,5 milligram och så är det 2 Mogadon. Det brukar vara en bra kombination. Ja, jag använder den själv och det blir inga efterverkningar. Om du dricker starkt kaffe på morgonen så får du upp ångan.
Tack.
Vid vilken tid vill du bli väckt?
Strax före 7. Jag måste vara på sjukhuset vid 8:30.
Kom då.
Thomas?
Ja.
Om man tvingar allting att vara som vanligt så blir allting som vanligt. Tycker inte du det också? Så det är i alla fall för mig.
For all of the attention that a lot of other Bergman films receive, I'm actually surprised how little face-to-face gets, because it is a very complex and very accomplished film in his filmography.
The movie really stayed with me, I have to say. I enjoyed it while we were watching it throughout. And then over the next several days, I kept thinking and rethinking it.
This is actually a chopped down version of a miniseries that ran about 4 hours that aired in Sweden back in the 70s. Bergman, I don't think, was a particular fan of it. And so it sort of went into the vaults. And instead, we're left with this near 2-hour version of Face to Face that, you know, unlike Scenes from a Marriage, where we sort of spoke about the theatrical version being inferior to the actual miniseries, Face to Face, as we see it at least, without the evidence of the other, of course, is a pretty good movie.
The edited version worked quite well for me. I felt like all of the pieces in the film really came together.
There is a competence in the work that allows him to elevate it.
I think there are several other elements in this film that are also familiar to us, but that are done very, very well. So for example, thematically speaking, there's this whole reemergence of the psychological drama, if you will, like with an even more direct reference, because the main character, Jenny, played by Lee Wallman, is an actual therapist, and she has patients and so forth. And the other element to me that was also quite reminiscent is this idea of color blocking and using color as symbolism, which we saw very, very prominently in Cries and Whispers. Here it's a little bit more subdued, but still quite noticeable. And the third thing is his use of settings to be symbolic as well. So we've seen him do this time and time again. Typically it's been kind of an exterior setting.
Like an island.
Like an island. But more recently he's really taken it kind of indoors, and it's the interiors that have a lot of significance and kind of map to the interiority of a person's mind.
For the first time, I think we've actually come to 2 separate interpretations of this film that almost seem quite certain. And I mean, you can examine Face to Face with the traditional analytical mind that we have taken to a lot of Bergman's past films, where you're looking at the psychology and the structure of the story.
The dynamic of the relationships.
Right, and then we were also talking about it and came up with different interpretations.
Like I said, this film really stayed with me for a few days afterwards, and I kept thinking about the more usual way that we approach Bergman's films and look at how the characters interact with each other, how they're reflected in society. And I still think you could do a really, really solid interpretation of it that way and learn quite a bit. But then I had this kind of radical thought, if you will, and going out on a little bit of a limb here. I thought, what if you take a reading of this film as a completely psychological structure and just put Jenny at the center of it and imagine her as if she was in a white padded room with nothing in it. And then everything that is introduced to us in the film is actually a projection or a reflection of her mental state. So, for example, one of the questions that I had in the film, which really triggered this train of thinking, was the character of her friend Thomas. And the fact that I'm still not entirely certain that he's real.
But I think it's actually the entire structure of face-to-face that you have to question what is real. In fact, a lot of the film seems like it's a blurry dream or some sort of distorted reality that really has no ground, no certainty. Whether it's the minute details like daylight, for example. Bergman sets the film at a time in Sweden when the sunlight is up for most of the year, which makes the viewer start to wonder, okay, is it nighttime right now? Is it daytime? I thought she went into that house in the evening, but they're talking about the evening, but it's not night, which I think is genius, and Bergman really utilizes that. It's one of the fantastic features of the film.
Bergman uses the concept of time and passing time, and particularly clocks or ticking clocks, as a really great distortion element. There's a great scene where Jenny is at her parents' house and she's having trouble sleeping, she's not well, and she takes sleeping pills. And as she is drifting off, he gives us this very prominent sound of the clock ticking, and then she becomes awake again to the same sound, but it's unclear whether she's awake or still asleep, and whether what she's seeing is a dream or whether it's the reality that she's gotten up into. And that happens several times throughout the film, and it's more and more fluid every time. Jenny's reality and her kind of mental state become really deceptive in the film, and it's difficult to follow along.
And visually, Bergman sort of codes this eeriness and creates a tone throughout the film that's really consistent. Whether it's his use of mirrors, which I think is partly where the title Face to Face comes from, but also his use of these structures of the homes, for example. There's scenes where we watch things through doorways, where we can kind of see what's going on, but not the entire reality. The walls are blocking something of the incident. I'm thinking in particular the near rape scene, basically what is a rape scene. We don't get to watch it as we would in another film.
It's interesting that you bring up that scene in particular, because for me, I read the coding in it completely differently. So the way that I see it, when you look at the shot full on, what you're really seeing is a hallway that you're looking down, and then it's separated into two rooms very directly, right down the center with the wall. And on the one side, you have Jenny, who's being assaulted, and on the other side, you have the sleeping character of her patient, Maria, who's the really insane one we meet at the beginning of the film. And the way that I read that scene was basically the two compartments of her mind, where she has the one side that she keeps to try and hold together her propriety, her discipline, her constant professionalism. And on the other side, you have this sleeping monster, if you will, her trauma that is always constantly trying to get out and trying to haunt her. And so the Jenny side is being assaulted right now. And we see in the following scene where she comes clean to Tomas about that rape, that's what really rips her asunder, if you will.
Right, but I don't think that you get that while you're watching the moment. Instead, as a viewer in the moment, you are trying to figure out what is going on in that corner. And what you explain seems to come afterwards in reflection.
But that's what I mean. This is a film that stays with you. And the meaning of the film builds and builds and builds. And the more you think about it, the more you can interpret it, and I think make sense of the film. I would venture to say the way Bergman would want you to.
I do think the scene of the two separate rooms marks a real turning point for the film, where everything opens up, but we also start to lose direction as Jenny begins to break down.
We really count on Jenny, or at least she's introduced to us at the beginning of the film, as kind of the stable one.
You would assume she's the psychologist.
Yeah, she's the therapist. She's supposed to make other people better. And some of the early coding that Bergman gives us, we don't recognize it until the very end, like you said. So for example, in one of the earliest scenes where she's seeing her patient Maria for the first time, there's a great shot where they're directly face to face, looking into each other, like mirroring each other. And at first we don't really think anything of it. We just think it's a close conversation. In reality, Maria is a reflection of Jenny's inner state. And as the movie progresses, we see more and more of that trauma coming to the surface. After her assault, Jenny's unable to cope, and she's unable to hold herself and wrap herself so tightly. And so we see all of her demons start to come out. And sometimes they come out in the real world. So when she's either having a conversation with her friend or she's in the hospital after her attempted suicide. And sometimes they come out more dramatically through her illusions or through her dreams, like the scary old woman with the glass eye, or in particular, one scene that I found to be really telling and powerful is the one where she's confronted with all of her different patients. And the way that I interpret that scene is it's not her patience, it's her actual traumas that are being reflected back at her. It's the things where she's damaged, where she's scarred, that she's never really dealt with and suppressed are actually confronting her directly as something that needs her help, that needs her attention, that needs to be healed and dealt with.
That entire scene is full of hints. I mean, she walks into the room and she's told that she's late and all of her patients are waiting for her. They've been waiting for over an hour and they haven't been dealt with, which is basically, as I see it at least, Jenny being told that she has left all of her problems, all of her demons unresolved, and they've all been waiting for some sort of resolution. When she comes face to face with those demons, each one signifies something different for her. For example, there's the woman with the mask that when it's removed, there's scars underneath. There's a woman with a ribbon hidden in her mouth, and it says, "They cut my head open, they operated on my fear, and when they put it back together, they forgot to remove my daily frights." Then there's Maria on the bed in her lustful, uncontrolled state. And to add to that, there's her grandfather in the closet as well, which she discovers. There's just so many secrets hidden in this small space.
It's hard to interpret at first, and we don't really get to it until almost the end of the film, where we're confronted with Jenny in the asylum or in the hospital when she's recovering after her attempted suicide, and she actually tells Tomas the story of her traumas, and then we start to piece it together. Her parents died when she was really, really young, and the scarring on the face is kind of like her trauma from losing her parents and being forever scarred. She was raised by, her grandparents in a very strict conservative upbringing, and they tried to kind of reassemble and put her back together and make her suppress all of this fear and anxiety of being left alone. So that's the woman with the ribbon in her mouth, and she was always encouraged to kind of be stoic and silent about these things. There's the grandfather in the closet, and Jenny herself was punished as a child by being locked in a dark closet, and she's always had that fear of claustrophobia and darkness. And of course there's Maria. Maria is kind of like the id figure in the film. She symbolizes all of Jenny's pent-up anger and fear, and to some extent lust, because she's so constricted. She can't really feel emotion. Even when she's having the breakdown about being assaulted, it's difficult to tell whether she's really upset about the fact that she was nearly raped, or about the fact, as she says, that she was so tight that the rapist couldn't actually penetrate her. And it's hard to tell which one of them she's more upset about. So all of that is a reflection of just how bound up she is and how overdue she is for a total breakdown.
All of this reflection really reminds me of Cries and Whispers, whether it's the setting, for example, the ticking of the clocks. What made this movie better or worse than Cries and Whispers, and how it dealt with flashbacks and personal trauma? Do you have a favorite?
I think I enjoyed them both differently, but Face to Face definitely was more impactful for me. It stayed with me a lot longer. Cries and Whispers I liked visually. I liked the color blocking of it. I liked the heavy kind of gothic symbolism, the crazy characters, but it wasn't very real for me. I couldn't relate to any of those people. Face to Face for me is fascinating because of the way that I'm leaning towards reading the film, which is, to my earlier point, really trying to take away all of the concrete things and the minute symbolism and the camera movement, and really read it like a complete blank canvas psychological type of drama. And for me that seems fascinating because I haven't really seen a film from Bergman before, except for maybe Persona, where he gave us so much license to interpret it in our own way.
And the film is full of many little Bergmanisms, if we can call them that. For example, there's a dream sequence that recollects prison. There's a moment where Jenny is stuck in a casket that is set on fire, and it kind of recalls Wild Strawberries. Bergman also refers to movies plenty of times, as he has in many of his other films, and they act here as sort of an escape for Jenny. She almost sees them as a way to resolve her problems, or at least that's how I interpreted it. When she tries to make up with Tomas, she invites him to a movie. She later tries to reconcile with him by inviting him to a movie again. There's a time when she's speaking with her daughter and she tries to connect with her daughter through movies. Her daughter isn't having any of that. It's almost like Bergman himself, who has always seemed to be working a lot of his problems out through his own films. Now, you sort of downplay the visual coding. You prefer to approach this in a different way, but I actually thought that the visual coding of this film was the starting point for building on further interpretation, whether it was the moment For example, when Jenny is picking at the wallpaper as she's sort of falling into the deep sleep of her suicidal attempt with prescription drugs. Those were the first moments for me that really encouraged me to look a lot deeper into what Face to Face was saying.
With Bergman, it's always in the details. And for me, it was also the small details that triggered kind of deeper thinking. So one of the things, for example, was his use of color in this film to really delineate between things that are external and proprietary, and things that are internal and could have psychological significance. So for example, her beigeness, her constant use of wearing beige clothing and beige shoes and everything beige, it's like a way to constrict herself. And the settings were also always color-coded. The green family room when she returns to her childhood, house. The crazy red robes that she wears in the dream sequences, and how eventually those all start to meld together. For me, those are all little symbols that Bergman tells us to look deeper.
I always find them a little bit frustrating because at first you know something is there, but you can't decode it, usually, until very late in the film, if not the finale. But you know he's assigning you a little bit of homework.
But it makes you pay attention throughout the whole movie.
That's true, and of course that leads to the ultimate question, do you think this one is essential Bergman?
I absolutely do. I think it's a very powerful film. I think it does a great job of both bringing together things that he's done in the past, as well as kind of signaling to what we can kind of anticipate in the future.
And I have to agree with you. I was on the fence about this for a little while, but I think that it is almost one of the hidden gems, or at least one that a lot of critics didn't give full credit to. And maybe one that if you haven't seen it yourself, you'll definitely want to consider discovering. There's a lot of depth here, and I think a lot of conversation to be had about what Bergman is getting at. That brings us to the end of this episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Be sure to let us know your thoughts on this film, as we're really curious to see how others interpret it.
You can subscribe to our channel on YouTube or visit us on our Facebook forums and leave your comments there.
And we will see you next time when we are looking at the film The Serpent's Egg. We'll see you then on Breaking Down Bergman.